For 4 years, the same question has lingered in celebrity circles. Where did Jessica Mulroney go? She was the confidant, the stylist, the gatekeeper to a rising brand. She was present for the fittings, the favors, the late-night calls, and the unguarded moments. Then, in 2020, she disappeared from the public narrative. The explanation offered was simple: cancellation after a controversy, a clean break, end of story. But recent reports suggest the silence may have had another cause. Sources say it wasn't shame that closed her mouth. It was fear. Breaking news now reframes the mythology around Meghan Markle, not as a sainted survivor, but as a figure accused of wielding power ruthlessly behind the scenes. According to multiple accounts, Mulroney has now moved beyond whispers. She hasn't sold a story. She hasn't tweeted. She has, reportedly, gone to lawyers, signaling that what comes next may be evidence, not gossip. And according to accounts tied to the legal material now circulating quietly, the story does not begin with a single text or a single photo. It begins with a pattern. A slow, deliberate escalation that sources describe as psychological pressure rather than emotional fallout. The dossier reportedly submitted outlines behavior that wasn't reactive. It was strategic. After the friendship ruptured, Meghan Markle did not simply disappear from Jessica Mulroney's life. She remained present in a way designed to unsettle. According to the allegation, she didn't block Jessica. She watched her, and then she reminded her that she still could. The first messages were subtle. Old images, moments from Toronto, harmless to anyone else, but not to the woman receiving them. These were photos from private spaces, private nights, private rooms. And in several of them, according to the claim, Meghan appeared uncomfortably close to Jessica's husband, Ben Mulroney. A hand on a waist, a lean that lingered, a familiarity that crossed an unspoken line. The implication was never stated outright. It didn't need to be. The message was psychological, not verbal. I was there. I remember things you wish you didn't. And I still have them. Sources close to Mulroney say the effect was immediate. The friendship, once framed publicly as sisterly, now appeared in hindsight to have a power imbalance. What had been sold as closeness began to look more like occupation. Meghan didn't just share Jessica's world, according to those accounts. She mirrored it. Same designers, same poses, same circles. The allegation suggests this wasn't admiration. It was replacement rehearsal. And when the friendship ended, the rehearsal material became leverage. Experts familiar with coercive control describe this as triangulation. Introducing a third party, real or implied, to destabilize trust and manufacture doubt. Jessica's alleged weak point was not her reputation. It was her marriage. The photos, sources say, were timed carefully. Not all at once. Just enough to reopen questions. Just enough to make silence feel safer than confrontation. One image, described in the file, allegedly shows Meghan inside Jessica's Toronto home while Jessica was away, wearing one of her dresses, drinking her wine, sitting beside Ben. Nothing explicit, nothing provable, just intimate enough to be poisonous. Those close to the situation say the goal was not exposure. It was containment. The implication was clear. Speak, and the context disappears. The images would stand alone. Rumors would fill the gaps. Jessica would be forced to defend not only herself, but her family. And so, for years, she did nothing. She protected her children. She protected her husband. She absorbed the doubt quietly, but according to the same accounts, the pressure never stopped. New images surfaced. Old moments resurfaced. Different apps. Masked sender IDs. Always just enough to remind her that the past was not buried. It was archived. And that silence was not being requested. It was being enforced. According to sources familiar with the timeline, the escalation reached a breaking point during what Jessica would later describe as her lowest professional moment. Shortly after losing her television role, when public scrutiny was already intense, her phone allegedly lit up again. Not with a call, not with a warning, with images, sent late at night through an encrypted platform, the sender masked, the intent unmistakable. Those close to the situation say Jessica didn't need confirmation. She recognized the style, the timing, the restraint. This wasn't rage. It was control. The first image, described in legal notes, appeared harmless at a glance. A kitchen, morning light, coffee on the counter. But the detail that froze her, sources say, was the clothing. Meghan, standing calmly, wearing a button-down shirt that did not belong to her. It belonged to Ben. The caption beneath it contained no explanation. Just a date. One that Jessica immediately recognized as a day she was out of town for work. The implication was silent and devastating. I was here. I was comfortable. I was playing a role that wasn't mine. More images followed. Darker. More intimate in tone. One allegedly taken inside a private booth at Soho House, Toronto. Low lighting. Close proximity. Meghan leaning toward Ben, her hand resting where a friend's hand would not normally rest. Ben's posture open, engaged, listening. When Jessica confronted him with the image, according to sources, his response was confusion rather than denial. He framed it as conversation, advice, friendship, and that ambiguity, experts say, is exactly what makes the tactic effective. Nothing overt enough to accuse. Everything subtle enough to haunt. Psychological specialists consulted on the file described this as manufactured doubt. The goal is not to prove betrayal, but to introduce uncertainty that corrodes trust from the inside. Each image forces the recipient to ask questions they cannot answer. Did something happen? Did I miss it? Was I replaced without knowing? And once those questions take root, silence becomes self-preservation. Those close to Jessica say this is when her perception of the friendship shifted entirely. What once felt like loyalty now felt like surveillance. Moments she remembered fondly began to look curated, collected, safe for future use. The realization was chilling. These were not memories kept out of nostalgia. They were assets, and they were being deployed with precision. 4 years, she stayed quiet, not because she believed the narrative being told publicly, but because the private one felt far more dangerous. According to those familiar with her legal move now, that silence was not consent. It was endurance, and it was running out. Sources say this phase of pressure reframed everything. The friendship narrative collapsed. The silence became strategic, not passive. And with each archived image, the stakes rose. Speaking risked chaos. Staying silent risked losing herself. That calculation, according to those reviewing the file, is what ultimately pushed her toward counsel, preparation, and a reckoning she could no longer postpone alone any further. According to the materials reviewed by those close to the case, the images were only one layer of the pressure. What unsettled Jessica more, sources say, were the messages that accompanied them. Not public posts, not emails, direct messages sent through secondary devices, delivered late, phrased as concern, but carrying an edge that felt unmistakably intentional. The language, they claim, followed a familiar pattern. Soft reassurance wrapped around a warning. Care disguised as dominance. One thread referenced moments only the two women shared. Private jokes, old insecurities, things said years earlier in confidence. Experts consulted on coercive dynamics say this technique is designed to collapse psychological distance. It signals omnipresence. You may think time has passed. It hasn't. I remember who you were when no one was watching. And I still have access to that version of you. Several messages allegedly pivoted toward Jessica's marriage without ever naming it directly. Questions about stress, about trust, about how hard it is to balance ambition and family. According to those who have seen the summaries, the subtext was clear. Stability is fragile, and I know exactly where it bends. Each message arrived without demand, without instruction, yet carried an implied consequence. Silence maintains equilibrium. Noise introduces risk. At the same time, sources say Meghan was cultivating a public distance. No visible conflict. No response. No acknowledgement. To the outside world, the friendship had simply faded. That contrast, experts note, is central to the control mechanism. Public calm paired with private intrusion creates dissonance. The target begins to question their own perception. If nothing is happening publicly, maybe I am overreacting. Maybe this is normal. That uncertainty, specialists say, is the goal. One message cited in the file allegedly referenced timing. A reminder of how narratives harden when told repeatedly. Another referenced reputation, framed not as a threat, but as concern for optics. You have children. You have a husband. You have a brand. Protect it. The absence of explicit threats is what made the pressure effective. Nothing to point to. Nothing to quote. Only implication. According to those advising Jessica now, this period marked a shift from emotional confusion to recognition. The realization was not that something inappropriate had occurred, but that something strategic was ongoing. The messages were not meant to reconnect. They were meant to manage, to ensure that whatever Jessica knew, suspected, or remembered stayed contained. By the time the contact slowed, the effect had already landed. Doubt had been planted, silence had been rehearsed, and the understanding had set in that the past was not past at all. It was a resource, and someone else was deciding when to spend it. Sources say that realization reframed every interaction that followed. What looked like kindness became positioning. What sounded like concern became calibration. And what felt personal was no longer personal at all. It was procedural. That shift, advisors note, is often the moment a subject stops enduring and starts documenting, preparing quietly for a future conversation ahead privately. According to people who later reviewed the compiled material, the turning point came when context began to surface alongside the images. Jessica, sources say, stopped reacting and started reconstructing. Dates were checked, travel schedules compared, old calendars pulled from storage. What emerged was not a single explosive moment, but a pattern of overlap that refused to stay abstract. One sequence referenced a Soho House gathering from the mid-Toronto years. The image itself, described by those familiar with it, shows proximity without explicit misconduct. A whisper, a shared laugh, a posture that suggested comfort, on its own deniable. Paired with timing, unsettling. The timestamp placed the moment late into the night, long after group events typically dissolved. According to the file, Jessica was not present. When she asked Ben about it, sources say his response was immediate but defensive. He minimized the significance, framing the interaction as professional networking, advice-seeking, harmless familiarity. Experts note that such explanations often coexist with blurred boundaries, especially when a third party has normalized closeness over time. Nothing inappropriate happened, he insisted, but the explanation failed to resolve the unease. That unease deepened when additional material surfaced. Not photos, but references to conversations, mentions of stress, of ambition, of men feeling unseen. According to summaries, MEGHAN positioned herself as understanding, as supportive, as uniquely attentive. Specialists in interpersonal dynamics describe this as emotional positioning, offering validation where distance already exists, and doing so in private, away from social correction. Sources say Jessica began to recognize the strategy only in retrospect. The friendliness had not been equal. It had been directional. Attention flowed one way, loyalty flowed the other. And when the relationship ended, that imbalance flipped into leverage. What had been given freely was now implied to be owed. During this period, the pressure reportedly intensified through absence rather than contact. No public defense, no denial, no closure, silence that allowed speculation to breathe. According to advisors, this vacuum forced Jessica into a defensive crouch, managing not only her own uncertainty but the risk of misinterpretation by others. By the time she began organizing the material, the narrative had clarified. This was not about jealousy or rivalry. It was about control over narrative space. Who gets to speak? Who stays quiet? And who carries the cost of disruption? That clarity, sources say, marked the end of endurance. It marked the beginning of preparation. From that point forward, every interaction was reassessed, every silence reinterpreted, every memory stripped of sentiment. What once felt chaotic became legible. Patterns replaced panic. Documentation replaced reaction. According to those involved, this was the moment the narrative stopped belonging to rumor and started belonging to record. The story was no longer something happening to Jessica. It was something she was preparing to tell, deliberately, carefully, and with the understanding that once spoken aloud, it could not be taken back without consequence. That awareness, advisors say, is what ultimately transformed silence from fear into intention and preparation for what came next. According to individuals familiar with the legal review, the most destabilizing element was not the imagery itself but what surfaced when Jessica began tracing conversations beyond her own messages. Archived devices, cloud backups, and shared accounts reportedly revealed fragments of dialogue that had never been meant for her to see. Not declarations, not confessions, casual exchanges, written with the ease of someone who assumed privacy was permanent. One screenshot, referenced repeatedly in summaries, allegedly showed a conversation between Meghan and a mutual contact from the Toronto circle. The tone was light, almost playful, but the content, sources say, landed like a blow. Comments about Ben's temperament, about how attentive he was, about how easily he listened. Then the line that shifted everything. He's good practice. The phrase appears repeatedly in the file because of what it implies. Reduction. Instrumentalization. A person reframed as preparation. Experts consulted by those reviewing the material say this language is not accidental. It reflects a mindset in which relationships are evaluated by utility rather than attachment. According to that interpretation, proximity to Ben was not about attraction. It was rehearsal, refinement, learning how to mirror, how to flatter, how to become indispensable to powerful men before moving to a larger stage. For Jessica, sources say, this reframed years of memory in an instant. Her husband had not been a confidant. He had been a testing ground. The intimacy, she sensed, was not romantic chaos but strategic familiarity. That realization was physically destabilizing. According to one account, she became ill after reading the exchange. The betrayal was no longer ambiguous. It was textual. Once that context emerged, other accounts began to surface. Quietly, former acquaintances from the Toronto years, describing a similar pattern. According to them, Meghan rarely engaged the wives. She gravitated toward husbands, asked about their ambitions, their frustrations, their sense of being overlooked. Not overly flirtatious, attentive, present, enough to feel significant. One source described it as emotional acquisition. Not seduction, but capture. The men felt understood. The wives felt unsettled, but unable to articulate why. Jessica, once the central figure in that social world, now saw the dynamic clearly. Targeting Ben was not incidental. It was symbolic. Undermine the center, and the structure destabilizes itself. According to those close to her, this is when silence stopped feeling protective and started feeling complicit. The shame was no longer hers. The manipulation had a shape, and once seen, it could not be unseen. What remained was a question of timing, evidence, and consequence. Not whether to speak, but how. Not whether the truth mattered, but whether it was worth the fallout. That calculation, advisors say, is where endurance ends and action begins. According to the reconstruction outlined by those assisting her, the next layer involved money, movement, and receipts. When memory blurred, paper did not. Jessica began aligning her travel records with social calendars from 2016, cross-checking dates she was away with nights that later appeared in messages. One date refused to fade. Early September, during the Toronto International Film Festival, when schedules were dense and alibis plentiful. On that night, Jessica was hosting a charity event. Ben was expected. He canceled late, citing work obligations. Meghan, also invited, declined with a migraine. According to the file, a receipt from Soho House, Toronto places 2 guests in a private room known as the Snug, a space reserved for discretion. The booking extended past midnight. The bill closed near 3 a.m., wine, security, privacy. What unsettled reviewers was the payment method. Not Ben. Not Meghan. A corporate card tied to a third party, long associated with introductions and logistics during those years. To advisors, the implication was facilitation. Not a chance meeting. Not coincidence. Coordination. Sources emphasize that the allegation is not framed as a conventional affair. The interpretation offered is transactional. A closing conversation. An exit briefing. Meghan was preparing to leave Toronto, to enter a different orbit, and to ensure that loose ends stayed loose. The person in the room mattered less than what he knew and who he could influence. Within this reading, the private room becomes strategic, not romantic. 4 hours to set expectations. 4 hours to establish silence. 4 hours to translate proximity into leverage. The materials suggest this was the moment earlier images were taken, stored, and later weaponized. Not souvenirs. Insurance. When Jessica later received a blurred bathroom photo showing a tuxedo jacket on a hook, the context snapped into focus. That jacket matched the gala Ben missed. The image, sent years later, functioned as a reminder. I remember the night. I remember the room. I remember who paid. According to those advising Jessica, this reframing transformed fear into clarity. The threat was not exposure of infidelity. It was exposure of overlap, timeline questions that would fracture a public narrative carefully curated around devotion and distance. If revealed, advisors say, the consequences would extend beyond embarrassment to credibility itself. That understanding explains the restraint that followed. Silence was not surrender. It was containment while evidence accumulated. The receipt, the image, the dates, the witnesses. Pieces that, together, told a coherent story. And once coherence existed, the balance shifted. What had been leverage became liability. What had enforced quiet began to demand response. That is when preparation turned outward, toward counsel, toward affidavits, and toward a moment when the archive would no longer remain private. According to sources, this phase concluded with a deliberate pause. No leaks, no statements, just organization. Timelines indexed, devices secured, witnesses noted. The objective was patience, not spectacle, ensuring that when disclosure arrived, it would be resilient, corroborated, and resistant to dismissal or distortion. Under pressure, truth survives coordinated scrutiny. According to those close to the unfolding legal strategy, the shift from documentation to confrontation began quietly. Jessica did not go public. She did not alert journalists. Instead, she issued what sources describe as a notice of intent, a formal signal that the archive she had assembled was no longer theoretical. It was actionable. This notice, advisors say, reframed the dynamic immediately. Silence was no longer passive. It was conditional. The implication was that continued pressure would trigger disclosure, not restraint. For the first time in years, the leverage reversed direction. At the same time, those involved say, Jessica confronted Ben with the reconstructed timeline. The receipts, the dates, the images. According to accounts, he did not deny the meeting at Soho House. He confirmed it, but challenged its meaning. What followed, sources claim, was not a confession of an affair, but an admission of coercion. He described the hours in the private room not as intimacy, but as negotiation. Ben allegedly told her that Meghan spoke about her future in global terms. About needing allies. About needing protection in the Canadian media landscape as she prepared to leave. He said she referenced access, influence, and consequences. If he helped shape coverage, she would include him in her assent. If he refused, she would reinterpret his attention as obsession. The implication, advisors note, was reputational destruction. This explanation reframed Ben's past behavior. His defensiveness, his insistence on discretion, his reluctance to confront Meghan publicly. According to those close to the couple, he had not been protecting her. He had been containing fallout. Experts consulted say this pattern aligns with recruitment tactics rather than romance. Identify proximity. Gather compromising material. Present opportunity. Introduce threat. Secure compliance. The target believes cooperation minimizes harm. The recruiter believes silence equals control. For Jessica, sources say this distinction mattered. The betrayal shifted shape. Her marriage had not been undermined by desire, but by leverage. That did not lessen the damage, but it clarified responsibility. The manipulation had a source. Armed with this understanding, Jessica's strategy evolved. She was no longer responding to harassment. She was preparing testimony. Not for tabloids, but for proceedings where evidence carries weight and language is precise. Every message was cataloged. Every image contextualized. Every witness contact logged. According to advisors, this was the moment the situation moved beyond personal betrayal into institutional risk. Once coercion enters the frame, silence becomes complicity. And once records exist, deniability collapses. The pressure that once enforced quiet now demanded resolution. The question was no longer whether the story would surface, but who would control its release, framing, and timing. According to those tracking the process, that final calculation marked the irreversible point, where private endurance ended, public consequence began, and every remaining decision was shaped not by fear of exposure, but by certainty that the record, once opened, would speak with its own authority, regardless of who tried to interrupt, reframe, delay, or deny what had already been preserved in the coming months ahead. According to sources familiar with the final escalation, the most unexpected move came after the archive was stabilized. Jessica did not leak. She did not threaten publicly. Instead, she made a call. Not to a reporter. Not to an editor. To Prince Harry himself. The connection, advisors say, existed from years earlier, an emergency channel meant for rare circumstances. This qualified. Those briefed on the conversation describe it as controlled and factual. No accusations. No theatrics. Jessica forwarded documentation. The jacket photo. The Soho receipt. The message referencing practice. She did not editorialize. She let dates speak. She let overlap speak. The implication, sources say, was unavoidable. Harry, according to accounts, did not respond immediately. He reviewed. He cross-checked. He compared the receipt date with his own messages, his own travel records, his own memory. The realization was not emotional at first. It was chronological. The night he believed his relationship was exclusive intersected with evidence that suggested otherwise. Experts note that timeline contradiction is uniquely destabilizing. It bypasses interpretation. It replaces feeling with fact. According to advisors, this is why the call mattered. It collapsed the narrative that had justified Jessica's isolation. The separation was not about controversy. It was about containment. Following that exchange, sources say communication patterns shifted dramatically. Silence replaced defensiveness. Distance replaced proximity. Those around Meghan reportedly noticed a change. Fewer messages. Heightened agitation. A sense that control had slipped. Jessica, meanwhile, continued preparing. She did not celebrate. She documented. The objective was no longer vindication. It was accuracy. She understood that once multiple parties compared archives, inconsistencies would surface without commentary. Advisors described this phase as convergence. Separate timelines aligning. Separate silences breaking independently. No coordination. Just corroboration. The strength of the material no longer relied on her voice alone. According to those tracking the situation, this is when the story ceased being personal. It became structural. Not a feud, but a record of influence, pressure, and narrative management spanning years. The risk expanded. The audience widened. At that point, sources say, the final restraint fell away. What had been held privately was now shared deliberately. Not as spectacle. As sequence. Not to destroy, but to clarify. And once clarity exists, advisors note, reaction becomes inevitable. The silence that once protected power now exposed it, and the silence that followed was no longer fear. It was shock. This reaction, observers say, marked the beginning of irreversible momentum. From that moment forward, every decision carried institutional weight. Lawyers adjusted posture. Advisors anticipated response. Narratives hardened. The material existed independently of emotion. It no longer required belief, only review. And once review begins, control rarely returns to its original holder. That understanding shaped the next phase, where preparation gave way to exposure, and private archives moved toward public consequence without urgency, theatrics or apology, only sequence, verification, and the steady erosion of a story that could not survive aligned timelines any longer when scrutiny replaces secrecy and patience outlasts denial completely and permanently for all. According to those aware of the final phase, the last safeguard was not a document but a device. An old phone, preserved deliberately, never reset, never traded in. For years it sat untouched, containing messages, images, and voice notes that existed outside cloud control. Advisors say this was not paranoia. It was foresight. When the decision was made, the device was transferred through counsel, not personally. A forensic extraction was conducted. Metadata confirmed dates, senders, and continuity. The material did not rely on screenshots alone. It relied on hardware integrity. That distinction matters in any formal review. Those who heard portions of the audio describe a tone that removed remaining ambiguity. Calm. Directive. Hierarchical. Not emotional. Not defensive. Statements framed as authority. References to access. To careers. To consequences. Experts say this language aligns with coercive control, not personal conflict. For Jessica, sources say, hearing the recordings ended years of self-doubt. The pressure had not been imagined. It had been articulated, recorded, preserved. The silence she endured was not misinterpretation. It was enforced. Once the extraction was complete, the archive reached final form. Images contextualized, messages sequenced, audio authenticated, witness statements logged. At that point, advisors say, the outcome was no longer dependent on narrative skill. The material spoke in plain chronology. What followed was restraint. No immediate release. No dramatic confrontation. Just readiness. Because when evidence exists, time favors accuracy over urgency. Every attempt to discredit would require engagement with substance, not suggestion. According to those involved, this is where the story ends and consequences begin. Not with revenge, but with record. Not with spectacle, but with permanence. The friendship was over long ago. The silence followed. What remained was accountability. The Toronto years, once dismissed as a relevant prelude, now stood as foundation. Patterns established their repeated later under greater scrutiny. The same tactics. The same pressure. Different scale. For Jessica, the choice was final. Protecting truth mattered more than protecting illusion. Whatever followed would follow. The archive would not change. And that, advisors say, is why this moment cannot be undone. Evidence does not recede. Timelines do not unalign. Silence cannot be reinstated once records are shared. The story moves forward because it already exists. It stands independent of opinion, insulated from interpretation, resistant to revision. Once entered into record, it demands response rather than dismissal. Institutions react. Lawyers advise. Narratives adjust. Silence becomes visible. What was once private becomes procedural. And in that transition, power shifts. Not suddenly, not loudly, but irreversibly. The archive does not argue. It waits. And when it is finally examined, it will not ask for belief. It will only require attention. The rest, advisors note, unfolds without assistance. Consequence follows sequence. Denial follows delay. And delay, when confronted with documentation, rarely survives sustained review. This is not a threat. It is process. Once begun, it does not reverse. It concludes only when records are exhausted, questions answered, and silence loses utility. From that point forward, what remains is aftermath, accountability, and record. She didn't stumble into power. She ascended deliberately, using proximity as leverage and silence as scaffolding. Now the structure is unstable. The timelines are aligned. The records exist. Jessica stands documented, not defeated, and the narrative that once protected influence is fraying under scrutiny. This isn't spectacle. It's process. Review replaces rumor. Evidence replaces mythology. The archive is open. Attention follows. Consequence follows. And what comes next unfolds without permission.